This is Mrs. Palmer Quay with the video for Unit 7.3. In this video, we will be covering the peripheral nervous system. In the peripheral nervous system, we are talking about the nerves that bring information from the central nervous system out to the body, or information from the body that goes back into the central nervous system. And you remember the central nervous system is defined as the brain and the spinal cord. When it comes to the nerves, there are two main groupings that we're going to be talking about. First, we're going to talk about the cranial nerves. These are the nerves that provide sensory and motor functions to the head and the neck. Most of the cranial nerves are coming out of the brainstem, or you could think of coming into the brainstem. That's where the connection point is with the central nervous system. And then your spinal nerves, which obviously are involved with connecting through the spinal cord. And again, these provide sensory and motor functions for the rest of the body, not the head and parts of the neck. Nerve structure is very similar to muscle structure in that you have nerves bundled together, and specifically we're really talking about neuron axons because the cell bodies are located someplace else. But the nerves have the axons wrapped around with connective tissue, just like you saw with the muscles, and blood vessels are involved in there as well. This is especially important for the peripheral nerves, that you have all of this connective tissue wrapping around the neurons, because there's a lot of mechanical stress being placed on those nerves as they move through your muscles. As you move your muscles and bend your joints, your nerves are being stretched and pummeled, and they need that connective tissue wrapping. The connective tissue ends with the word neurium, so we have endoneurium, perineurium, and epineurium, just like you saw with your muscles. Cell bodies, as I said, are not found as part of the nerves. They are found grouped together in ganglions. The ganglions just means a grouping of cell bodies for a neural cell, and they are either located in the body for the autonomic nervous system, within the spinal cord for your motor nerves, and we'll see that as we get to those specific nerves. So here is a drawing of the organization of a nerve, and it looks very similar to what we had seen all along for the muscle cells. A spinal nerve coming out of the spinal cord. It's wrapped in an epineurium, and then you've got bundles of fascicles. You can see the blood vessels in with the connective tissue on the nerve level. And then we can go down into a much more, breaking right down into the actual axon coming out of the nerve, the motor nerve. You won't have to memorize this in the same way that you had to memorize the muscle cell. I'm just providing this here for your information. Notice, too, that we have neurolemma instead of the sarcolemma, things referring to the cell membrane. Specifically for nerve cells, they get their own name, neurolemmas. So let's start with the cranial nerves. They're abbreviated with the letter CN for cranial nerve, and they're given numbers using Roman numerals. Most of your cranial nerves are mixed, so they contain individual nerve fibers that are both either sensory and or motor. A few of your cranial nerves only provide sensory information. The cranial nerves innervate. They provide nerve impulses for both somatic, which are your skeletal muscles, the voluntary muscles under your control, and the autonomic muscles and glands. The cranial nerves are numbered from anterior to posterior, moving across the brain, and this we're looking at the underside of the brain. Here's your brainstem down here. As I said, most of your cranial nerves are connecting or coming through the brainstem. In our sheep brain dissection, we noticed the olfactory nerve, cranial nerve number 1, and also you saw the optic chiasm. So this is part of cranial nerve number 2. We'll be working our way through all of these as over the next few slides, but you can see that most of the rest here are coming out of the brainstem. Notice also that there are right and left hemisphere positions, that you have 2 of each of these nerves, one that is providing sensory and motor innervation to the right side of the body and the brain, and the other side to the left side. So starting with cranial nerves 1 and 2, just giving some specific. These are the purely sensory nerves. The olfactory nerve is the sense of smell. The optic nerve is the sense of sight. The olfactory nerve comes in through a lot of teeny tiny holes in a part of the bone called the cuneiform plate in the ethmoid bone. I don't know if you remember seeing this bone when we were doing the skull, but it has lots and lots of, it has a section that has lots and lots of little holes in it. And that's where the rootlets of the olfactory nerve come through from the nasal passages into the skull. And it connects with a part of the brain called the olfactory bulb, which is on the underside of the frontal lobe. And we saw that with the sheep brain dissection. Your optic nerve crosses over. We saw that X in the optic chiasm, and it starts to integrate with the brain at the temporal lobe, but many of the nerve fibers continue on to the occipital lobe, where the visual processing center is located. Your next two nerves, cranial nerve 3, is the oculomotor. So you can tell from the name that this is a motor nerve that's involved in moving your eyeball. The oculomotor nerve also allows you to constrict your pupil when it is exposed to bright light or you need to focus on something close. There is a tiny bit of sensory fibers in this nerve. When I'm saying some sensory on some of these nerves, we're talking mostly about proprioceptors, the part of a sensory nerve that tells you where something is positioned in space. The trochlear nerve is another motor nerve, and this also involves the movement of the eyeball and a little bit of sensory nerves and proprioceptors. Cranial nerve 5 is trigeminal. This is a rather large nerve. If you go back to several slides to the picture of the diagram of the brain, you'll see that it has 3 smaller nerves coming out of a rather large nerve trunk, and it is mixed. It provides or sends sensory information from the face, scalp, and teeth back to the brain to be analyzed, and then carries motor information to the chewing muscles and the muscles in the floor of your mouth below your tongue. The abducens is another motor nerve, and it's involved again in the movement of the eyeballs back and forth as compared to up and down. Cranial nerves 7 and 8. The facial nerve is a mixed nerve, so it has both motor to muscles of facial expression and to also some of our excretory glands. The tear glands and the salivary glands are told to excrete those tears or saliva by the facial nerve. And your taste receptors send their information back to the brain through the facial nerve. The acoustic nerve, or the vestibulocochlear nerve, is another sensory nerve. It's involved with 2 senses, the sense of hearing and also your sense of balance. We don't usually think of balance as being a sense, but it is something that is probably more closely related to our other 5 senses than some of the other processes our body undergoes. Cranial nerves 9 and 10. The glossopharyngeal nerve is another mixed nerve, cranial nerve 9. It's involved in sensory information regarding the cardiac, respiratory, and blood pressure reflexes, so that it's part of the homeostatic system, that if the respiratory or blood pressure or cardiac rate needs to change, information goes back and forth on the, or information comes in on the glossopharyngeal nerve. So the sensory information saying what's going on with those body's processes comes in through nerve number 9. It provides motor impulses to salivary glands again and muscles of the pharynx, the back of the mouth. The vagus nerve is a rather important nerve that moves beyond the head because it will go actually all the way down to the abdomen. It's a mixed nerve. It's involved again in this reflexes, involved in maintaining heart rate and respiratory rate and blood pressure. When I was undergoing childbirth preparation to have my children, we were told that during a contraction you had to make sure to breathe, and the reason you did concern the vagus nerve. If you hold your breath during abdominal contraction, you actually decrease the cardiac rate. It would lower your heart rate, which would be a bad thing to do when you are in labor. So that is why there's all that emphasis on breathing in a contraction, because we don't want to affect the vagus nerve and send a trigger to the reflex that would lower the heart rate. And then finally on to cranial nerves 11 and 12. The accessory nerve, number 11, actually is an accessory to the spinal cord because it's moving down into the neck and the shoulder muscles. So again, it is moving beyond the head and actually reaching down to work with some of the first nerves the first spinal nerves to innervate the muscles of the shoulder. It's also involved in speaking, which we all know is a pretty important thing, as is the hypoglossal move, because it is a motor nerve that connects to our tongue, and the tongue and the delicate positioning of the tongue is something that helps you in diction and saying words clearly. Now we'll move on to spinal nerves. There are 31 pairs of nerves, and these spinal nerves are mixed nerves, that they contain both sensory and motor information, and they include directions to both the somatic, the voluntary skeletal system, and the autonomic, the hypostasis, the balancing glands and muscles that are involved in keeping you in your internal environment in the right place, regardless of what happens in the external environment. Spinal nerves are named after which vertebrae they come out of, and so there are 8 cervical nerves because the first one exits above cervical vertebrae 1, and then cervical nerve, or spinal cervical nerve 2 exits below the vertebrae, as do all the others. So we have 12 thoracic nerves, since you have 12 thoracic vertebrae, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and then we have 1 coccygeal nerve. The spinal nerves, since they are mixed, are formed by merging nerve rootlets that come off of the spinal cord. From the dorsal side of the spinal cord, you get your sensory nerves, and the anterior side provides your motor nerves, and then these come together to form the spinal nerve, the mixed nerve that then travels out to the rest of the body. So here's a diagram showing this. That's your spinal nerves. You've got 8 pairs of cervical nerves, and they're coming out. You can see these little diagrams showing you the nerves coming out from the spinal cord. You'll notice that there are, we'll see closer pictures later, but there are sections where the nerves seem to be very highly branched and intertwined. These are known as a plexus, and they're important as to get motor function or sensory function organized as it's coming in and out of the body. The spinal cord, if you remember, ends just below the beginning of the lumbar section of your vertebral column, and so this lower area, which has just many spinal nerves kind of coming down independently, and so that is why you can have a lumbar puncture or an epidural given in this part of the spine, because you are able to, the doctor is able to slide the needle in between the spinal nerves instead of taking possibility of damaging the spinal cord itself. If you notice over here that they've kind of color-coded it, that these cervical nerves tend to be affecting things from your head and your neck down to your hand. Your thoracic nerves are primarily involved in your chest and abdominal muscles. The lumbar nerves are what are controlling your legs, and the sacral nerves are involved with some other important functions, sexual functions and excretory functions. In the previous video on the central nervous system, we mentioned the spinal cord tracts, that there are groups of nerves that are all going one way and they group together in the spinal cord. We're talking about the axons of the nerves, so this is the white matter of the spinal cord. There are 3 main regions where we find spinal tracts. There is a posterior region here, an anterior region here. You can see this deep fissure is the indicator that we're looking at the anterior part of the spinal cord. And then 2 lateral sections. And since as I said, the spinal tracts are nerves that have similar functions, they are divided into sensory or motor tracts. So on this diagram, the blue color represents the sensory tracts, the red color is the motor tracts. Sensory tracts can be found in all 3 regions, but motor tracts are only found laterally or in the anterior section. So the important nerve tracts that I want you to pay attention to, we have first the vesiculus cuneatus and the vesiculus gracilis. These are sensory tracts, blue color, posterior region, sensory tracts that are conducting sensory information associated with touch and pressure and body movement, things that are going on with your skin and your joints and your muscles being carried by these 2 vesiculus sections of the spinal column. Then we have the spinothalamic. There's an anterior and a lateral spinothalamic tract, and the name tells you these are things that are going from your spinal column to your thalamus. The thalamus, if you remember in the central nervous system video, we talked about how that's where all of the sensory informations come in and get analyzed and determine whether they're important or not. So again, things from pain and temperature and touch and pressure, things that you might want to decide whether it's important or not, go through the spinothalamic tract. And then you have the spinocerebellar tract, again, anterior and posterior, two tracts that are carrying information from the spinal cord to the cerebellum. Remember, the cerebellum is where we have coordination of muscle movements, and so these are sensory information that help with the coordination of muscle movements. On the motor side, we've got the corticospinal tract, and cortico refers to the cerebral cortex, the thinking part of the brain. Again, we have one lateral and one anterior cortical spinal tracts. And so these are impulses coming from the cortex, from the cerebrum, down the spinal cord to innervate skeletal muscles. So they are going to the voluntary part of the nervous system. You're thinking about wanting to do a movement, and so then it's being carried by the corticospinal tract down to the muscles, the skeletal muscles, to have that movement happen. The other two that I want you to know, the reticular spinal here and the rubrospinal, these are involved again in muscles. They're motor neural tracts, but they are the more unconscious muscle involvement. So things involving muscle tone and muscle coordination and maintenance of posture, things that we don't necessarily think about but our body is taking care of, and to some extent activity of various glands like sweat glands. So the rubrospinal and the reticulospinal tracts are the ones that take care of those unconscious motor movements. So to look a little more specifically at how a spinal nerve is put together, we need to go into the spinal cord and consider that you've got the gray matter section here in the middle, and then the white matter around the outside. And again, of course, gray matter is where you're going to find cell bodies for your neurons and also some unmyelinated axons, and then the white matter is where you have all the myelinated axons. Motor nerves have their cell bodies here in the gray matter, and so we've got the axon coming out of one of these nerve rootlets and eventually joining together to form a spinal nerve with a lot of other individual neurons. Sensory nerves have their cell bodies in collections of ganglions just outside the spinal cord. They're still within the vertebral column, so they're still being protected by bone, but the cell bodies of sensory nerves are found here in the dorsal root ganglion. And these sensory nerves, of course, are bringing in information from the sensory receptors in the skin and the muscles, and then they're sending their axons further towards the spinal cord and possibly up one of those nerve tracts that we were talking about, or if over here on the other side we're seeing a reflex arc where your spinal nerve is connecting directly with a motor nerve going back out. But of course that's only for reflex. Most of the sensory information is continuing on to the brain where it's going to be analyzed. So the cell bodies for sensory nerves are found in these ganglion. They're called dorsal root ganglions. They just call this little section coming out a root. Sometimes it's also called a branch. I don't know that they can make up their mind. But anyway, you've got various groups of nerves coming out of the spinal cord. Then they join together to form a spinal nerve. So since there's both motor and sensory information, that's why your nerves are mixed. Now I mentioned that the nerves form these big branching sections. They're called plexus. So there are 3 plexus that I want to talk about, and they're the cervical, the brachial, and the lumbosacral sections. The plexus serve as a way to sort spinal nerve axons so that axons with different origin points can reach the target point of the body in the same peripheral nerve. So they're coming out of the central nervous system, being carried by different axons or different groups of nerves, and then they're sort of resorted after they leave the spinal column. We left out one whole section of the spinal nerves, the thoracic nerves. You notice here we've got cervical, brachial, and lumbosacral, but what about thoracic? Well, the thoracic nerves do not form a plexus. They pretty much come straight out of their section of the spinal cord and then go directly to become intercostal nerves, nerves that are going in between the ribs, the costal region. And so they're involved in the muscles and the skins of your upper abdominal area. So starting with the cervical plexus, there are 4 nerves involved in that, cervical nerves C1 through 4. Of course, since these are surrounding cervical vertebrae, the first cervical vertebrae has cervical nerve 1 and 2, so it's the first 3 vertebrae. These are involved in sending and receiving nerve impulses from muscles and skin of the neck area. And some of these axons, especially from the 3rd and 4th cervical nerve, recombine to form the phrenic nerves, which are very important in controlling the diaphragm and the breathing rate. So this is a diagram showing how the cervical plexus forms. Here are your first 4 spinal nerves, cervical nerve 1, 2, 3, and 4. And of course there's a vertebrae 1, 2, and 3 shown here. But just to see how these are branching and interrelating and axons are moving so that axons from cervical nerves 3 and 4, for example, are both coming together to form the phrenic nerve, the nerve that's going to the diaphragm to innervate breathing, so that this allows information that is coming from various parts of the brain to be sorted and reassembled and put together in a more efficient manner. The brachial plexus, I'm sure you'll recognize the word brachial, meaning we're referring to the arm and the forearm and the hand. These are involved, the nerves I'd like you to remember is they involve the radial, the median, and the ulnar nerve. The ulnar nerve is the one that gives you the pain when you hit your funny bone. They are all 3 of these nerves not only innervate the muscles and the skin of the arm, but they also go all the way down to the hand and allow you to use your fingers in the fine motor skills the way that you do. So here's a diagram from a different source, just showing the brachial plexus and then coming down to form these important nerves. And then we have the lumbosacral plexus. This goes from thoracic nerve 12 all the way down to your coccygeal nerve. And these are from your lower abdomen to your feet. 2 very important nerves involved in your legs to your feet are the femoral nerve and the sciatic nerve. The sciatic nerve is the largest and longest nerve in the body because it goes from the bottom of your sacral section of your vertebral column all the way to your big toe. So this is showing your lumbosacral plexus with diagrams. Here's your sciatic nerve. You can see coming out, forming several nerves coming together because it is a very big nerve. And then the femoral nerve here in the front, another very large nerve innervating muscles and skin on the anterior portion of your leg. We call the areas, the sensory areas of the body that are providing information to these different spinal nerves, dermatomes. And so if someone experiences an injury to a spinal nerve, a loss of sensory information, the ability to feel senses in a certain part of the body, is a clue to which nerve or nerves is affected. This also is an example of segmentation. If you remember that many organisms have this segmented body, and so we see that in our nerve system, that a nerve has a particular segment of the body that it is responsible for, and it's kind of an exclusive privilege that that particular nerve provides sensory information from that particular part of the body only. And finally, we'll move on to the autonomic nervous system. These are the things that happen automatically, part of homeostasis. They keep our internal system in balance, involving what's happening with smooth muscle of organs, cardiac muscle of your heart, the excretion of various things from your glands. The difference about this between the somatic and the autonomic nervous system is where the cell bodies are located. There are many more ganglions in the autonomic system outside of the central nervous system, and we'll see this in a diagram in a minute. And so where the cell bodies of the somatic system are found inside the central nervous system, the motor neurons have their cell bodies in the gray matter of the spinal cord. The sensory bodies for the somatic are in the dorsal root ganglion, and so they're practically in the spinal cord. They're just a centimeter at the most outside because they're still inside the bones of the vertebral column. But your autonomic nervous system have ganglia often very close to the target organ that you have cell bodies for postganglionic neurons. You've got 2 neurons transferring things in many cases. Autonomic nervous system has 2 divisions. We mentioned this earlier. You have the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic is all the things that happen when you are stressed because you need to, something is dangerous and you need to fight or run away, flight, so that when you're feeling, something dangerous is happening, your heart rate goes up, your breathing rate goes up, you're much more alert and energized, adrenaline is pumping through your system. These are all things that come from the sympathetic nervous system, whereas the parasympathetic system is the opposite of that. It's giving us, when we're ready to just kind of kick back and relax and digest our supper and everything's calmed down, that's the parasympathetic system that is controlling those sorts of response. They're not really antagonistic. It's, again, the negative feedback loop, so that one may be activated more than the other so that the body stays in the proper balance for whatever situation it is in at the moment. So here, these are two diagrams showing how your neurons connect. The somatic nervous system here is on the bottom. That's the one we're very familiar with. These are motor neurons. The motor neuron has its cell body inside the gray matter of the spinal cord. And what you have coming out of the spinal cord is one very long axon until you hit the neuromuscular junction on your skeletal muscles. So this, is what we've seen, what most of our nerves are when it comes to the somatic, or the voluntary part of our muscular system. In the autonomic nervous system, you have a ganglion, and it may be close to the spinal cord or it may be close to the target organ, depending upon whether you're in the sympathetic or the parasympathetic system. And so you have one neuron coming out from the spinal cord to that ganglion, and that's called the preganglionic neuron for obvious reasons. And then you have another neuron that goes from that ganglion, because that ganglion, of course, is where the cell body resides, and to whatever target muscle or neuron, or muscle or organ, and that's the postganglionic neuron. So the presence of ganglion are what make the autonomic nervous system distinctly different from the somatic system. So this diagram shows both of these systems together, starting over here with the sympathetic division. The sympathetic division has its ganglion located very close to the spinal cord, and not only do neurons go from the spinal cord, like we have one right here that goes from the spinal cord, this is your presynaptic preganglionic neuron, attaching here to the postganglionic neuron. So not only does directions go in this lateral direction, but also these chain of sympathetic neurons are also connected vertically. So they can also talk to each other within this chain of ganglions, as well as receive information from the spinal cord. In the sympathetic system, then, the preganglionic neuron is short in relation to the postganglionic neuron. You can just see we've got, this chain of ganglions are very close to the spinal cord, but then you have a very long neuron, these are in blue, going out to whatever target organ is being focused on by whatever neural response. Notice also that the sympathetic nervous system, the nerves are in the thoracic and just the very, very beginning of the lumbar section. So these are coming out of your 12 thoracic nerves and your first 2 lumbar nerves. Those are the spinal nerves that are involved in controlling the sympathetic nervous system. So the parasympathetic nervous system, in comparison, does not have a chain of ganglia close to the spinal column at all. The ganglia are out by the target organs, and so here we've got some ganglia just kind of drawn in the middle. And so in a parasympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic, I keep on wanting to say presynaptic, but preganglionic neuron is the longer one, and then it's a shorter one after the ganglion. Sometimes you have more than one nerve connection. Here you see we've got 2 going to the eye. Sometimes there's not a very definite ganglion. See some of these digestive neurons. You don't see a big ganglion involved. But the parasympathetic system then there still is involved in 2 neurons taking the information from the spinal cord to the target organs. Notice also that the parasympathetic system is coming out of your cervical vertebrae and your sacral vertebrae. So these are the spinal nerves involved in your parasympathetic division are different than the spinal nerves involved in the sympathetic division. So just remember, sympathetic is for when we're wanting to power up the body because there's something that we've got to deal with right now. We need our muscles, we need alertness, we need the heart and breathing rate going. Parasympathetic is when we can kick back and relax, calm down, take care of all those kind of things that have to happen so far as maintaining your body, digesting your food, and producing, letting muscles relax and cleaning up waste products and such. That occurs from your parasympathetic division. So that is what I wanted to cover on the peripheral nervous system in this video. There'll be one more video tidying up some developmental situations involving our nervous systems.